Well, hello, and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined, as always, by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg, and we are glad to be with you today to jump into BCO Chapter 20. I was about to say 21, but it's just an even Chapter 20, the election of pastors. Let's do 20-2. Every church should be under the pastoral oversight of a minister, and when a church has no pastor, it should seek to secure one without delay. A church shall proceed to elect a pastor in the following manner. The session shall call a congregational meeting to elect a pulpit committee, which may be composed of members from the congregation at large or the session, as designated by the congregation. The pulpit committee shall, after consultation and deliberation, recommend to the congregation a pastoral candidate who, in its judgment, fulfills the constitutional requirements of that office and is most suited to be profitable to the spiritual interests of the congregation. The session shall order a congregational meeting to convene at the regular place of worship. Public notice of the time, place, and purpose of this meeting shall be given at least 1 week prior to the time of the meeting. So this is the question we ask. Well, this is the question we ask all ordinands coming through. Tell us how a pastor is elected. But even before that process starts, that first sentence at the beginning is very significant. I wonder if either of you have good thoughts on that. That every church should be under the pastoral oversight of a minister. It's a pretty straightforward sentence.
Yeah, and this is why you see some churches will get like an interim pastor. We just heard one of our former guests was called as a interim pastor of 10th Pres, Johnny Gibson. And so even if there's not somebody that's permanently in that role, there needs to be some oversight, somebody that is checking in on things and knows how the process is working and checking on it. So I know what I found interesting is should secure one without delay. I've known some churches that purposely seem to delay because it was a long pastorate or, they're not going fast on the process. It seems at least the BCO is suggesting you shouldn't delay that process. You should get it started as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's helpful in the spiritual sense. It's helpful in the practical sense. Your ruling elders will be taxed further without a pastor at the helm because somebody has to do the work, whether that be Sunday school or preaching, whether they are exhorting or not. They'll have to find someone to exhort or preach. And so it's just helpful to have, for everyone's sake, someone who's doing this as their full-time job to help maintain and continue the ministry of the church. Sometimes without a minister, it's maybe not in the CEO sense, but the church can be adrift. It could lack vision. And it's not because necessarily the pastor's the one driving the vision solely, but it's hard to know where you're going when there's no helm at the ship at all, even with experienced session. And so there are practical benefits to obviously having a pastor as well as the spiritual ones.
What do y'all think about churches that are having trouble keeping a minister? And I'm thinking specifically of financial reasons. So, we have a few churches in our presbytery just now that are without a minister, and it looks like it might be difficult, for them to call a pastor. And a lot of that is just size of the church, size of the town, financial resources available to them. What are some, I don't know. How have y'all seen this practically worked out where smaller churches like that can still try to abide by this, that they should want to be under pastoral oversight and that they should not delay in seeking it?
There are creative ways to do this. I'm thinking of Mississippi Valley. There's often guys that will go throughout the Mississippi Delta and they'll preach regularly from the seminary, but sometimes there's a relationship developed with a particular student and they call that student as a stated supply, and that's close. It's close enough, I would think. But another creative thing that I've seen done is with Zach Bird, who is pastoring multiple churches on Sunday. And so one of those churches can't afford him fully, and so, or at least at the time. And so they had multiple churches come together, and he pastored multiple congregations. Charlie Winger did the same thing. He was pastoring, I think, 3 or 4 congregations at once. In his early ministry, he may have been an intern of the presbytery or something like it, but he went around. And so the church had a regular diet from the same person, which is also helpful. That I may not have said is that it's helpful to hear the same person preach, whether they're great or not. You'll have a consistent diet of working through texts through the Bible. And so those are some creative ways to think through it. Just because you may not be able to afford a full-time pastor's package doesn't mean that there aren't creative ways to help solve the problems in 20-2.
Yeah, I've seen before where actually because of the yearly reporting of the payments and the salary of the pastor, we noticed one was going down quite a bit because of several families had left the area. It was a shrinking community. And in seeing that, we actually had the presbytery kind of come in and say, do we need to go down to mission status? Do we need to actually have the presbytery support some things to try to get the church back on its feet? Because the pastor was looking at a bivocational ministry. So there's kind of we ended up with some compromise of a bivocational ministry as well as the presbytery helping a church through a situation like that in order for them to keep a pastor, because we knew if they lost the pastor, it'd be hard to get another guy in there, especially with low finances.
Yeah, and so the next part of 20-2 is this process of finding the minister. And so the pulpit committee is elected by the congregation. This is huge, right? This goes back to preliminary principles that we've talked about a congregation being allowed to elect the men who serve over them, which includes their pastor. And so the congregation elects the pulpit search committee, which can be made up of members of the congregation. It can be made up of members of the session. I gather that some of this is meant to imply that it could be the session. You could appoint the session to be your search committee, and then they go and look for somebody, and they sift through documents. Presumably, they listen to sermons. They maybe in the olden days they would go visit churches and actually. I remember hearing older ministers tell stories of, I was sitting there one day and 10 people showed up and I didn't know who they were. And it turns out they were a pulpit search committee from a church, 100 miles away that was looking at me, and different days. Anyway. And so then the committee comes back and tells the session they have a candidate, and they call a congregational meeting, not more than a week away, or no, not less than a week away, excuse me. And the process of that congregational meeting is in 20-3, but I thought first, there's some other things that go on in the middle of this search process, right? So usually a guy's going to come in and preach. There might be some other social activities. How have you all seen this work out? I mean, you guys have both been called to a church. When I came here, we came up 2 or 3 different times across a month or two, once just with a committee, once with a session, once to preach in the service for the congregation. How did it work with you guys?
Well, it worked differently in different times because this seems to be assuming a church with one pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And so this may look differently for an assistant pastor, obviously, or an associate pastor. And the assistant pastor, it was just the session because they didn't have to necessarily do all of the process of the search committee. With the other, they had a search committee that was made up of at least one elder, one deacon, and then some other people in the congregation that they had elected to go through that process. I'm interested if I've heard of other churches that have just had the session be the search committee. And I wonder what the pros and the cons are of should your session, I don't know, should churches kind of prefer to just have their session do it since that's the people going to be working with them? Or is there a need to have more people from the congregation there? I don't know if you guys had opinions on that.
I mean, I think for assistants and associates, and I think I don't know if I can say his name or not, but a friend of ours has shared with us his opinion on this, and I think I tend to agree with him that the minister should be involved to probably a significant degree when it comes to assistants and associates. Those are the men that are going to be supporting his ministry as a senior pastor. As an associate minister, my task is to support the work of my senior minister. I serve with him, alongside him. And so having the senior minister involved in the searches for those men, I think can be very significant. And so if the session was functioning as a search committee, it puts the pastor there as well. This wouldn't prohibit him from being a part of a search committee, but not being a member of the church, if the session was made the search committee, the pastor would be allowed to be a part of it. That's just half thought. Scott was going to say something much more wise and insightful.
Well, yeah, every church is different, and the way of finding a man is different. There sometimes churches will do in serial. They'll just take one candidate at a time. They'll look through and vet all of their resumes, and they'll say, okay, this is the guy we want to start with. and they just go one at a time. And if he's not available, then the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. I prefer that as the pastor, as the one on that side, because the committee's only considering one person at a time. Then there's the beauty pageant approach, which is that the session or the committee will have multiple guys come out, and whoever is the most popular amongst the congregation and the interview process will be the one that gets the call. So there's no standard way of doing this at all. Every process seems different, and when I talk to people about processes, they are about as varied as can come. When you invite out, how many times you invite out. It probably would be helpful if we had some greater direction to help, like bundles or packages for committees. It's like you're now part of this committee. Now what should you do? We could use probably more direction in that regard. Obviously, 20-2 is offering the liberty to do almost whatever you want as it relates to finding a man.
I do think the session needs to be involved. And so whether it's just the session or it's a session plus, I'd like to see all of the session involved somehow in search committees. Although I think it's also important to get the perspective of some of the people that may be doing the other ministries in the church. You know, if there's a guy that's usually working with the youth, it's nice for him to be able to interact to say who's going to support me in this or who might be involved in this. Or even some of the women's ministry or women in the church. It's nice to get the perspective on just even how somebody treats women in the church and meeting them. So even if they're not official members, just to have some advisory members that are in the room for discussions, I think is important. So I almost don't like it's either members of the congregation or the session. I kind of think like it should be both to some degree, at least in an advisory role.
I did think it was interesting that there's only a week notice given to elect a pastor while we give 30 days to elect ruling elders and deacons. Now, I realize there's some different issues in play, right? You've got the men are present when they're ruling elders and deacons. You have time to get to know them. Presumably the man's not hanging out for 30 days before you elect him as a pastor, but
I think this is seeing that there might be a presbytery meeting and then a vote that's coming up pretty quick, and you've already had this time to interact with them. You don't need more time. So the order for a teaching elder is probably different than the order for a ruling elder.
Yeah, just don't go on vacation if you have a pulpit search committee at work. You never know. It could be 7 days notice. Don't plan anything. Well, what about this meeting? So 20-3 outlines, really a couple of these paragraphs are going to get into the details. So 23, when a congregation is convened for the election of a pastor, it is important that they should elect a minister or ruling elder of the Presbyterian Church in America to preside. But if this be impracticable, they may elect any male member of that church. The session shall appoint one of their number to call the meeting to order and to preside until the congregation shall elect their presiding officer. All communing members in good and regular standing, but no others, are entitled to vote in the churches to which they are respectively attached. You need somebody to moderate the meeting, and you can't vote if you're not a communing member in good standing of the church. Do we need to say any more?
Okay. Well, the first part there, that usually it's a minister or a ruling elder. That I think the reason it's important is that they know the BCO, and so that they're not getting dinged by the presbytery later. But if not, that you have somebody that knows what they're doing and has a checklist they're going through to make sure that they've done all the things that they should do there.
We have a pastor who works out of bounds in our presbytery, and he helped a smaller congregation, call a pastor. He worked with their search committee and kind of walked along with them. And he was the presiding minister at this meeting. So he actually signed. He acted as the moderator, I think, and signed the call that the congregation approved, which is a little weird to see a guy from a whole different ministry signing a call, but he was moderating the meeting where it happened. So, non-communicant members can't vote in these matters. Anybody under discipline can't vote. Associate members can't vote. A little trivia in there for you. Other than that,
I was going to ask that.
You're going to ask what?
I was going to ask you that question. Can associate members vote?
They can't.
Well, some issues there that are maybe worth bringing up is, number one, limiting voting. If you see this in conjunction with other places in the BCO, you can't limit who can vote, say just everybody over the age of 18 or everybody who is male or something like that. There's when it talked about the privileges of membership, you have all rights and privileges of membership if you're a commuting member. And so you don't divide those two things. There's been some attempts to limit voting in the past, and it's been struck down that you're going to have some sort of an amendment if you think that there should be some age limits to voting for elders. But generally, if you are able to discern the body for the supper, you're able to elect elders. I noticed too, Almquist mentioned and cites from some precedent here that proxy voting is very frowned on here, that's not been allowed before, of having somebody vote for you. I wonder if virtual would be bad too, but I think proxy, especially to say like, hey, go vote yes for me or go vote no for me, because of the provisions we come into for a large minority. How does somebody proxy vote if there's going to be, additional voting that happens that people are trying to discuss and see, okay, there's a large number of people that don't want this person. How do we work this out? Proxy voters can't do that. So you need to be there.
And that gets into 20-4.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Method of voting: the voters being convened and prayer for divine guidance having been offered, the moderator shall put the question, are you ready to proceed to the election of a pastor? If they declare themselves ready, the moderator shall call for nominations, or the election may proceed by ballot without nominations. In every case, a majority of all the votes cast, excluding blanks and abstentions, shall be required to elect. Could we do a whole episode on this paragraph? I wonder.
There's a lot of curiosities here.
Yeah. Yeah. You ever seen somebody stand up in a called pastoral election and nominate somebody that wasn't recommended by the search committee? Because that seems to be possible.
Yeah, I would want to hear stories on that. I would want to be a fly on the wall in that congregational meeting.
Maybe it's better to back up and say how wise, that they begin with prayer for guidance. We start by praying, just like we start all of our court meetings. We sometimes too casually toss aside these sort of structural things, but prayer is so important and such a weighty matter of electing a new minister to come be your pastor. And so then they say they're ready and they proceed to election, presumably upon the man that's being recommended by the search committee. And I suppose subsequently by the session. Was the session's the one technically bringing it as the callers of the meeting? How do y'all view that?
Yeah, I will note the presence of the word "or" there, so you don't have to allow for nominations.
Right.
So, I would probably suggest that you don't.
I just want to know. I would like to know a case where it'd be wise to do that.
So important for the presiding person to be a minister or ruling elder of the PCA that knows what he's doing, so that he knows to skip that part if he's just reading along. How terrible for him to be up there. All right, I'm going to call for nominations. Wait, no.
Well, the last part is somewhat recent. I actually had an older BCO that had the old wording on 20-4 at the end. It didn't have that parentheses there, excluding blanks and abstentions.
When did we change it?
It's been in the past few years.
It's been recently, the past few years.
But that was a problem of like, well, what is a majority? Because if you're counting abstentions, say you have, 20 votes for, 5 against, and 20 abstentions, is that a majority? What do you do with the abstentions? And technically that's not a majority unless you specifically say, look, your abstentions are going to be out. And I think that's good because if you're going to abstain, you're actually voting no, because you're not getting to the majority in a sense. And so I think you need to have either positive yes or no if you're voting in this.
Is this like a vote for a third party is a vote for the party that you don't like?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. I've had this conversation with some of our deacons the last several years when we've had elections of various kinds where actually, so one of them was when I was being elected as associate, and then the other ones was when we had deacons and elders, and they were trying to figure out like, what does this new provision mean? How do we count? Because I think they actually had somebody had a little program or like worksheet that you added it all up in the right way and it kind of told you. But now it's changed a little bit, right? So the way you count it is different now. You have to sort in different ways.
I would argue that nothing has changed. This is a clarification, not a change. Because our rules, Robert's rules argues that when you're voting on an election, abstentions are never counted because it's an election. You go to the ballot box in a few days here to vote for the president. And if you decide to go into that that area and vote at that church or wherever you're meeting, and you decide to take your ballot and write your name down and then just turn it in without putting anyone voting for anyone, then you just didn't vote. And it's the same in this matter. Obviously, abstentions are important in other matters of the church, but abstentions are excluded in voting for someone because it's a tangible person. And elections are done in a way that you either vote someone up or you vote someone down. You don't get to do soft no's. Even if your church practices them, they don't hurt or they don't hurt either side. And that's according to Robert's rules. And I think the BCO is clarified in this way because people were confusing this part of our Constitution.
Because we usually take majority as 51%, and if that percentage wasn't working. So this is a helpful clarification.
50% plus one to be
50 plus
to be
one.
clear. Yeah. Well, by the way, thanks for keeping our podcast so timeless by referencing the election so many times.
It's October 29th, and we're voting in 3 days or whatever, 4 days.
Oh, let's keep going. 20-5. On the election of a pastor, if it appears that a large minority of the voters are averse to the candidate who has received a majority of votes and cannot be induced to concur in the call, the moderator shall endeavor to dissuade the majority from prosecuting it further. But if the electors be nearly or quite unanimous, or if the majority shall insist upon their right to call a pastor, the moderator shall proceed to draw a call in due form and to have it subscribed by them, certifying at the same time in writing the number of those who do not concur in the call and any facts of importance, all of which are proceedings, shall be laid before the presbytery together with the call. Very, very interesting paragraph. Very wise of our BCO authors to put this in here. How do you handle a divided vote? And a particularly tense divided vote where you have a large minority against the majority. And I appreciate this. If a large minority of the voters are averse to the candidate, kind of be like, well, wasn't there no vote? Their statement of their aversion to the candidate, but okay. But it basically says, hey, if this is gonna be a tense thing for the church, the moderator needs to try to figure this out before proceeding. Have y'all ever seen this happen before anywhere?
They probably should more than we think.
I have heard of it happening before. I think there's something important here, though, and that is large minority is not defined. And so your session before an election happens probably needs to define what a large minority is. Is it 40%? Is it 33%? Is it 25%? What is that number? And also, I think within this process, perhaps the candidate, if he's there and he knows what's going on here, that may say something to them. This seems to be an escape hatch of, whoa, there's like 40% of the congregation that does not want this guy. And when they say, hey, we're gonna put this to you again, perhaps there's something of like kind of a reballoting to say, can you be persuaded to go along with the majority, and everybody goes along with it? That's one thing. But if they say, can you go along with this, and they're still saying no, this could divide a church. It could split a church. And so either the candidate may say, I don't think this is worth this because I might be hurting the church instead of helping it by coming here. Or, the session realizes, oh, this was not a good pick. To be able to have some sort of an escape hatch there. But you're going to have to talk about what does this look like before it happens? Because if you just say 10%, that's a huge minority. You're like, no, it's 20. Like, you need to decide that number. You need to decide the process. Okay, this is what we'll do. We'll first have a speech, trying to persuade the majority or the minority, game this out before it happens.
I think Robert's rule says somewhere greater than a third. But I've heard 20%. So it's probably somewhere between 20 and I guess 33% is a large enough minority if you need a spectrum. But I think Roberts, I was just looking it up as we were talking, says a large minority is greater than 1/3. And so if a third of the congregation has voiced opposition to the vote, then I think that the moderator should do this almost like mechanically. Proceed to go this way, not because of personal bias, but just because that's the right thing to do. Though I think if you have 20% of the congregation vote against you, you're probably not accepting the call.
Yeah, I was going
If
to
I
say,
had
I
to
know
guess.
most ministers I know that have taken new calls go into the election process with a number already in their head. And 20 would be a very high percentage, I would think, for most men to still take a call if they had 20% against them.
A fifth of the congregation doesn't want you to be there.
Now, if it's a particularly, if you know it's a hard situation, if you're going for the purpose of helping, right, there are certainly exceptions, but 20% is a lot. But this is basically just the alternate side of that, right? The pastor's got a number in his head, but the session and the church need to have a number in their head too and be ready. 20-6 is basically just it's not basically, it is the form of a call. I'll read it. It's good for some people to hear this, I suppose. 20-6, form of call. The terms of the call shall be approved by the congregation in the following or like form. The church, being on sufficient grounds well satisfied of the ministerial qualifications of you, and having good hopes from our knowledge of your labors that your ministrations in the gospel will be profitable to our spiritual interests, do earnestly call you to undertake the pastoral office in said congregation, promising you, in the discharge of your duty, all proper support, encouragement, and obedience in the Lord, that you may be free from worldly cares and avocations. We hereby promise and oblige ourselves to pay you the sum of whatever effectual call is for the particular man, a year, in regular monthly or quarterly payments, and other benefits such as manse, retirement, insurance, vocations, moving expenses during the time of your being and continuing the regular pastor of this church, in testimony whereof we have respectively subscribed our names this day. And the moderator attests this and signs his name as well. Most men in a presbytery are going to hear this read out loud several times a year, probably, depending on how many men you have coming into your presbytery, because we read these out loud. Well, actually, now that I think about it, we haven't read them out loud in a long time. They go in our
You just
white
have to
book.
read them.
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
the type of presbytery that when it says first reading, the guy gets up there and actually reads the whole thing
Previous presbyteries, they did that sometimes. They would read the whole call
instead
out
of
loud.
just having you read it privately to yourself?
Yeah, I filled in for our credentials chairman one year, and I had to read the calls of the men that were transferring in. It was weird. I think maybe it wasn't in the white book, and so there was no way for them to hear it. But yeah,
That reminds me when Mel Duncan read the
whole.
whole Nashville statement before the presbytery or before the PCAGA.
So
He
good.
sat there and read the whole thing.
He should do audiobooks. That was good.
I heard him interviewed one time. Or maybe did he tell us that it was his daughter that had that idea about him reading the statement.
Yeah.
Well, I do think there's a little interesting historical note, because that's what I like. Smith says that this language is largely the same as that came from the Westminster Assembly when they were doing this. So there's an ancient pedigree to this.
Do any of you guys get paid quarterly?
No.
I can't imagine a single pastor in the PCA, unless it's like a retired gig that he's not depending on it, getting paid quarterly.
I know a guy who negotiated a salary for $1 because he was getting paid somewhere else. So that might even be yearly.
Yeah, that might be a yearly thing.
He gets paid 8 cents a month.
Yeah. Otherwise, the quarterly would be a quarter. Yeah.
It costs more money to transact than the thing.
Not even worth the envelope the check is sent in, man. 20-7. If any church shall choose to designate its ruling elders and deacons or a committee to sign its call, it shall be at liberty to do so, but it shall in such case be fully certified to the presbytery by the minister or other person who presided, that the person signing have been appointed for the purpose by public vote of the church, and that the call has been in all other respects prepared as above directed. I know this seems technical, but it gets back to preliminary principles, right? The congregation has to call the pastor. And so presumably their signatures need to be on the call, but they're allowed to designate that responsibility to another group, like the elders or deacons or a committee, to sign the call for them. And the presbytery just needs to be told that that's what's happening, to assure the presbytery that the congregation has called the man and not just some committee somewhere took it upon themselves. Y'all okay?
Yep.
20-8. Prosecution of a call. One or more commissioners shall be appointed by the church to present and prosecute the call before their presbytery.
Usually just a ruling elder. A ruling elder goes, but I find it more than that. Like sometimes whole sessions go. just to see their own pastor-elect get examined. It's almost like an event for the elders to come. I know for my call here at Providence, I think the session invited the diaconate as well. I don't know if anyone, I don't think anyone came on the diaconate, but they just invited everyone to go. But there was some lead. The lead was one of the ruling elders. I don't know if they ever vote on it, right? They should, but I don't know if they ever do.
Yeah, it becomes more significant if there's some resistance, since the church has to make the case for it. So they have to actually prosecute their case of why this man should have this call and why they need this call and why it needs to be this package. So if there's pushback from the presbytery, that's significant. If not, he just sits there and says, I'm here to support.
And this is on the other side too, right? I believe when we get to the dissolving of calls, the session can elect a representative to defend their case on why to dissolve the call. We just dissolved the minister in Ileana, and the session was put off because they're like, wait, we don't want to prosecute this pastor's dissolution. He's going to a new church, you know. But it is their right. They have a right to represent the church as they go before the presbytery.
We see this happen most of the time. Not, well, and I'll just say 20-8 seems a little more formal, I suppose I'd say, compared to what we do in our presbytery, because usually it's just that the call is in the white book and it's there, and we ask the guy if it's good with him, and he says yes, and we take it from there. There's not usually any sort of one or more commissioners prosecuting the call before the presbytery. It's just, here it is, and we sort of take it for what it's worth. Yeah. So 20-9, we keep going. When a pastor desires to accept a call to another presbytery, he must be examined and approved by the presbytery for the pastorate to which he's being called and must be released for transfer by his present presbytery from his pastorate. So we're moving out of how a pastor is called by a congregation and moves into a presbytery, and now we're looking at what the other side of it looks like. If he wants to go somewhere else. Basically, they're just saying that presbyteries have to receive and presbyteries have to dismiss.
It's an interesting crunch, right? Because presbyteries don't meet monthly. They meet sometimes only twice a year, or at most typically quarterly. And so getting all of these handshakes to complete is not always the easiest. And it does create some difficulty because the releasing presbytery has the veto power in saying, no, we do not release the man. And so it's kind of an odd thing that you're working with, but there is supposed to be a handshake where both the receiving presbytery and the sending presbytery agree before the man actually begins his work. And it's sometimes difficult because it doesn't happen overnight. The presbytery might have to call a meeting in order to ensure that it happens.
All right. 2010. A congregation desiring to call a pastor from his charge shall, by its commissioners to the presbytery, prosecute the call before its presbytery. The presbytery, having heard all the parties, may, upon viewing the whole case, either recommend them to desist from prosecuting the call, or may order it to be delivered to the minister to whom it is addressed, with or without advice, or may decline to place the call in his hands, as it shall appear most beneficial for the peace and edification of the church at large. No pastor shall be transferred without his own consent. If the parties are not ready to have the matter decided at the meeting then in progress, a written citation shall be given to the minister and his church to appear before the presbytery at its next meeting, which citation shall be read from the pulpit during a regular service at least 2 weeks before the intended meeting. What is going on? Because this is unrecognizable.
Well, the presbytery may say this all looks in order and it's fine, but the presbytery may have concerns. And so there may be something that happens, such as just telling the church this is not going to happen, or saying, why don't you have your guy come and prosecute this case before the presbytery? We'll make a case for and against and have the presbytery vote on it. So that might be a scenario that you might see on this, that at least I've seen before in a presbytery, that we didn't think that the person was going to go through, but they wanted them to still make the case. And so we let them.
Yeah, there could be all sorts of reasons for 20-10. It could be that the church had gone through something difficult and the presbytery sensing that they're going back in the same direction And they might think this is just a bad fit. The pastor might not be under discipline or anything of that nature. It's the presbytery looking back at history. Say if the church had an issue with pedo communion and their last pastor blew up the church over it, and then the next guy they call is also pedo communion, that they might say, well, no, we're not going to let you teach that, but we also think this is just a bad situation for the future of the ministry here. And so sometimes it could be just a tangible, the credential committee saying could cause substantial problems for the church, and therefore we think this is not a good fit. And so they could litigate that before the presbytery because maybe the credentials committee erred or not, And so it offers the congregation, again, we talk about church member rights. This is one of them in many regards where the church does have a say even before the presbytery as they disagree with the presbytery. They could take it to before them and prosecute the call or seek to.
Y'all are doing great.
Do you have anything to add, Ben? Have you ever had a call prosecuted against you?
No, I loved Morton's on this. He just said this step is generally overlooked today. We usually look much more congregational when it comes to calling ministers and looking for ministers. And some of this just is more Presbyterian. Pear said
it is helpful. It is helpful.
Oh, yeah. Pear said these provisions give Presbytery a real authority to decline to approve a call for reasons it seems sufficient. That's the part I think we overlook the most today. As usually calls happen is that a church and a pastor kind of agree, and then they come together and sort of inform the previous church and the presbytery, like, hey, we've been dating and we're gonna get together, and the rest of y'all just need to get in line. But the truth is that, I mean, this whole chapter has been showing us that the presbytery has the authority over a man's call. And while they can't put a man out of church without the church's consent, they do wield the authority over that.
And this pushes us away from congregationalism, where the congregation is the ultimate rule. I mean, you see this in PCA churches, non-PCA churches. If the congregation voted to call this guy as their pastor, how dare they reject it? Like, the congregation believes this man is called by God. But there's a little more to it than just the congregation's vote. The congregation could be, lied to by someone. The congregation could be deceived. It could just be a bad call overall. And sometimes it's hard for us to submit in our own modern context to authority, but the presbytery is not acting as a villain. They're not supposed to be. They're providing accountability and oversight for your congregation. They're trying to protect your congregation. And you might be in the midst of making a decision that's, because you're on the inside, you can't see clearly, and you're on the precipice of destroying your congregation inadvertently. It allows an external force to address the situation perhaps a little more neutrally and clearly, especially if it's been tumultuous locally. And so this pushes back against the natural congregationalism in our society, maybe against the grassroots just a little bit, as the presbytery does approve these calls.
The precipice of destroying your church unintentionally. It's too long for a title, but man, it's perfect. Okay, sorry.
If you've ever seen a presbytery say no to a call and the church accept that, I think it's a beautiful thing. Like the church basically saying, look, you saw something we didn't, and submitting to it, I think can be a really a real good opportunity for growth and just seeing actual godliness and submission to your brothers there. If you've ever seen it and seen the church accept it, I think it's a beautiful thing.
Often painful, but beautiful.
Yeah. 20-11. If the congregation or other field of labor to which a minister, licentiate, or candidate is called be under the jurisdiction of a different presbytery, on his acceptance of a call, he shall be furnished with the proper testimonials and required to repair immediately to the presbytery in order that he may be regularly inducted into his office.
This is one of those sections that Ben didn't think was important. And so, Ben, why wasn't this section important to you?
Yeah, because there's at the previous page, you'll notice that there's a large blank space under 20-10, which I thought meant was the end of the chapter. So when I copied and pasted this into our show notes, in our show document to prepare, I just thought this was the end of the chapter. But come to think of it, there's a whole nother page where 2011 through 2013 live and breathe and have their being. But But I'm especially interested, Scott, in how you understand and would show application of 20-11.
I have no idea. I stopped at 20-10 because that's where the document stopped.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if I told you to jump off a bridge, that whole
I
thing,
would just jump.
yeah.
I said, if it's not important to Ben, it's not important to me. And so who cares if it's constitutional or not?
I appreciate the trust. Jared, surely you know what 2011 is talking about. Are these one of the ones that Almquist only had like a sentence on, right? I mean,
yeah,
if Almquist
everybody has to agree. I mean, you have to have everybody realizing that this is a good idea, including the previous presbytery. So it's just one of those things, making sure we know everybody needs to be shaking hands on this every which way.
I love it. Shaking hands every which way. 20-12, a candidate or licentiate found fit and called for missionary service by missionary agency or presbytery shall be examined by presbytery for ordination. If approved, the presbytery shall proceed to his ordination. I'll speak to this one. We just did this last week. We had a guy come who's been serving in unordained ministry in Ukraine for the last decade or so, and he decided there's a work there through MTW. There's a church at work, and they wanted to call him to full-time ordained ministry to preach the word and minister the sacraments. And so he came back to the States. He's been going to Covenant Seminary and just finished up his degree, and we worked him through credentials, and he was approved by Presbytery a week ago today, as we're recording, and was ordained just a couple nights ago at an evening service at their church in Memphis. And so his call is from MTW. He's being called I think they called him an evangelistic missionary, and he's going to go serve in Ukraine with MTW. So I don't know if that maybe that anecdote is enough to explain the paragraph. 2013, last paragraph in chapter 20, a missionary who is an unordained teaching elder in another denomination found fit and called for missionary service by a missionary agency or presbytery shall be examined by presbytery for admission to presbytery in accordance with BCO 13:6. If approved, he shall be enrolled as a member of presbytery. Did I say ordained or unordained? I apologize. It's the same thing, right? Just he's coming from somewhere else. He's already been ordained somewhere else.
Yeah, I think all of this paragraph is implied elsewhere in the BCO. It's just clarified here.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's been said. It just hasn't been written everywhere on every page. So we got to write it everywhere. Well, guys, how do you feel after BCO 20? What's still lingering? Anything we need to clarify? Anything that is standing out to you that needs to be said?
What if you have a box of unopened ballots that you discover later? Have we thought about that? Or, I don't know, rigged elections? Maybe we can get into real controversial territory here.
We collect ballots from the cemetery next to our church. Is that acceptable? I don't.
Why does only the church militant get to vote, not the church triumphant? It's just not fair.
I was often pondered
in
these.
Illinois, so
vote early, vote often. That's what we do in Illinois. Providence only has 100 people, and there are 300 votes for my election as pastor.
As a pulpit search committee would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about anything that we have discussed, please check out the show notes in your podcast player, or you can find them at politymatters.org. If you've enjoyed the show, consider following us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast app of choice. We release very early every Tuesday morning, straight to your inbox, so that you can have it for your morning jog or commute or black coffee or whatever it is that you enjoy. If you have questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. You can get in touch with us on Twitter as well if you need us. And be sure to check the show notes for some links, other things we've discussed. We've made some references down there. That's all we've got for you today. Thanks so much for spending time with us. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
goodbye.
Goodbye.
Y'all take care.